Equity Subcommittee on Queer People at the University advises the University Senate on policy matters of interest to sexual orientation and gender identity minorities. And the committee is composed of undergraduate students and graduate students and administrative staff and academic staff. Darren Barney, whom you had dinner with last night, said online a couple of days ago, "The fact that McGill will recognize Judith Butler with an honorary degree gives hope to many of us whose faith in the university has been challenged in recent years." I think I speak for the committee when I say we agree with that. Now, many of us read your work and have been nourished by it directly in our scholarship. But of course, people come from all kinds of disciplines, and not all of us perhaps read your work directly. But all of us who were associated with the nomination appreciate how, in your work, in the address this morning, in your activism, you open space for questioning, speculating, imagining, for pressing at the boundaries of the legitimate and the illegitimate, the speakable and the unspeakable. We appreciate and celebrate the rigor and respect for text and dialogue that you model. You're combining at times a close textual analysis with matters of justice, which too rarely, I think, we speak about openly. You've sharpened our critical sensitivity to the processes that make some lives unlivable, and invited us to attend carefully to the ways in which even redrawing boundaries to address the exclusion of some may have repercussions for others. Thank you for helping us to build and sustain a more livable world. We're really thrilled to have you here and to have seen you honored and celebrated so publicly by our university this morning.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. That was, it's very moving to me, and I really appreciate it. But I thought it might be interesting just to talk about the travels of gender for a brief moment. And I think I say this in the piece, when gender trouble was first proposed to be translated into French, the publisher Fayard said it was an inassimilable, which is of course the word used for unwanted migrants. And then, other people in Paris, mainly, in about the three arrondissements, which speak for France. Well, it's true. I mean, people say, well, the French, it's like, you mean the 5th, 6th, and maybe, some part of either the 4th or the 7th. Anyway, it's not. But others said, oh, it's the McDonaldization of the French Academy, or something terrible. And then, of course, gender became something that you could say in French, which was very interesting, especially hearing people say gender. And there was gender studies. And they even established a couple of chairs in gender studies, which was fabulous. And, with some pride, I think, although there were other people who thought, no, let's keep femininity in relationship to gender, or let's keep la différence sexuelle in relationship to gender, or, different ways of handling that. Différence des sexes seemed to be different from différence sexuelle and gender. Anyway, it was hard to track, but I saw that there were many different things going on. And of course, also queer studies has had a harder time taking hold in that particular place, and a hard time in Germany, and a very hard time in many other places. But it's a term that disrupts some of the more disciplinary or institutional ways we have of organizing knowledge, and suggests that we can't just take sexuality as a simple problem of identity, but as something that comes in diverse forms and interrupts various forms of life that may not seem to pertain to sexuality on the face of it. And the organization of politics, the organization of kinship, the organization of time, of generational thinking, of the couple, of sociability and intimacy and passion and sexuality and love. Like, can we really do a good job thinking about any of those things without all of those categories and some queer ones as well. So, I think that disruptive effect is felt and sometimes it's resisted, but it's an important kind of development, and it's also one that kind of raises the question of what's the relationship between an academic field and even a discipline and a broader social movement, or a broader set of social movements. How do they inform each other? How do they resonate with one another? In my view, it's not the task of the academic to prescribe what a social movement should do. That's a form of kind of intellectual elitism or, at worst, social engineering that I don't really approve of. But I do think it's important for academics to move in and out of their more closed institutional spaces in order to find out what's happening and to allow what's happening to register in academic language and institution making and unmaking. So there is a kind of obligation to move among registers and to be someone who is not one place or another exclusively, but who takes on the task of translation, because that's sometimes precisely what has to happen. Going into popular audiences and trying to explain what certain academic concepts are, or moving back into the academy and trying to say what you think is really happening on the street or in popular struggles or in the midst of demonstrations. And allowing oneself to be something like a vector, or I wouldn't call it a translation machine, but I think, there's a problem of translation that is happening all the time for those of us who are thinking these fields in relationship to broader social and political movements and phenomena. The last thing I thought I might say here is just the following, that in the gay marriage debates, and I'm sorry to use France as my reference right now, there are other places I could use, and but it's been in the news, as you know, especially recently because of the gay marriage legislation that has passed and some of the violent demonstrations that ensued. And what I wanted to say there is that there were many people, like in Lille, for instance, there was a demonstration contre genre, against gender. And I was trying to think, what does it mean to be against gender? What does it even mean to be for gender? Is it a kind of, football team? Is it, I don't know, is it a flag that one waves? I mean, I didn't really understand contre genre. And it seems to me that what they were saying is that the term gender has allowed for people to think about the cultural variability of how people are embodied. In other words, they can become trans, they can shift their morphology, they can transition from female to male or from female to trans, or they can transition out of those categories into some other space that they may name in a different way. And so part of it was to say we've gone too far, there's too much freedom and excess and variability, and what we need to do is bring all that back to biological male and biological female reference, and to build social institutions on the basis of those clear binary mutually exclusive reference. But being contre genre also meant, or means apparently, to be against things like gay marriage or adoption for people who are outside of heterosexual marriage, and that includes, all kinds of people who may be in gay couples, or maybe out of gay couples, or maybe in complex kinship arrangements, or maybe single women not attached to a man, maybe two men, maybe one man. Poor guy, one man. It's like, oh boy, that is the impulsable. So if we think about that, well, what is parenting or the rights to parent, or even like being a good parent, what does that have to do with what kind of sexual arrangement you're in? whether you're married, whether you're coupled, whether you're heterosexual, bisexual, whether you have a complex life that none of us really need to hear about. Right? You've got like a long story that goes, whatever. It seems to me that when people gathered to be against gender, they were also gathering to be against gay marriage and gay adoption, or the access to reproductive technology for people who are outside of established heterosexual marriages. And that means that gender then signifies something like new organizations of kinship. It signifies something like the separation between marital status and parenting rights, something that in many states and in several countries is already established in law. And some established set of established causal sequence is interrupted. Okay, you are a certain biological sex. As a result, your sexuality must be or should be heterosexual. The social form that heterosexuality should take is marriage, and the having of a child should be restricted to a procreative privilege exercised within the context of established heterosexual marriage. Wow, who can do all that? Some people easily do it, and it's a great pleasure for them, and I am very pleased to know that works. And they do it with some ease, or maybe some ambivalence that they can manage. But the idea that we should all kind of be railroaded into that one trajectory seems really hard, because people do have questions about their biological sex and the one they were assigned, and how they feel about that assignment, and whether they're going to accept that assignment. That's part of what I think you read in the piece that I gave you today. What is it to be from the beginning called a certain sex, and also to be gendered. Already to be called a sex is part of gendering, because people are going to call it in a certain way, and they're going to mean something by it, and that's going to be communicated. So we're already in a kind of cultural realm there. But a whole lot of other people, like I may, have totally clear, unequivocal sense of what my sex is, but that doesn't mean that my desire follows from that in some way, some predictable way. What would that even be? And it used to be the case that in psychiatry, if you were a man and you desired another man, that meant you were passive and actually then feminine. The only problem with that is that the man you desired probably wouldn't be feminine, but if he was feminine, he would also be a woman, which means that every homosexual man is a lesbian. Right? There's no way to actually get passive and active together over there. And similarly, if you're a woman and you wanted another woman, you were aggressive or active or masculine, and if she also happened to be a lesbian, she was too, which meant that you were guys together. So the thinking outside of the heterosexual box has been extremely hard to do, and I see the new DSM has made great changes. It's already, in the last 15 years, 20 years, a number of psychologists and psychiatrists have really worked hard to open up those categories and depathologize many of these movements. But there's a whole lot more work to do, and it's these areas like kinship and marriage and parenting and psychiatry, all of them are linked with what we do in the academy. We think about those phenomena. They're given to us to think, and we make certain kinds of interventions, and sometimes we even get lucky enough to be cited in their legal briefs or in the American Psychiatric Association, and that's a good thing. Finally, I just wanted to say that gender's not a universal, I work on it a lot, I have worked on it a lot. It's a term that's really crucial to my own thinking, but probably because I came through a certain language and read sociology and anthropology of a certain time and was working with that lexicon. But as I've traveled, or as I've confronted the way in which my own work or other work in feminist and queer theory has been translated in different countries, I find that it comes up against real impasses. And not because everybody is committed to biological sex understood in a certain way, but because the term gender is sometimes not even a term. Sometimes it only comes about as the inflection of a verb. It doesn't have a substantial place in the language other than the inflection of I refer to you, or I refer to something else, or I refer to myself. Then in those modes of reference, gender emerges, but it's not a thing. And it can't be understood as an object or a substance that can be analyzed separately from the relationships in which it's lived. And if there's something kind of more or less general that I could say about gender, I would want to say that it is relational, and that it works in language and it works in institutions in ways that are sometimes quite explicit and sometimes quite implicit. But one gets treated a certain way, or one speaks a certain way, or one is spoken to a certain way, and it emerges in the context of those kinds of interactions. You're not included. No one ever speaks your name in a certain context. No one ever assumes you might be part of a group. That also can be gender. Deafening silence can be the attribution of gender, can be the presence of gender. So it seems to me that gender studies can't market itself to every culture and every instance. It has to figure out what the problem of translation is, and actually sometimes let its vocabulary go in the name of understanding better how these kinds of issues are approached in different ways and in different languages. And so it's not an ideology that needs to market itself as such. It's a particular vocabulary that emerges from several times and spaces, and it comes up against certain kinds of blocks, and that's terribly important to allow that to happen and to learn from that and to revise our understanding of how language and power works accordingly. The only other thing I guess I would add, and maybe this is a bit more theoretical, is simply that it's not just that gender doesn't translate into some languages, and it does not, but gender is really hard to translate at all, because calling someone a gender, or being called a gender, or being treated as a gender, it is enigmatic. There's something enigmatic. What is expected of me? What does this term want of me? I was in a hotel room last week in London, and a gentleman came and knocked on the door, and I was very busy, and he said, excuse me, I'm here to check the mini bar. Excuse me, Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam, like that. And I could tell he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was just panicked. He was panicked. And I saw he got more rigid. Mr. Madam, Mr. Madam. And I saw it was really obligatory that I intervene and try to handle the anxiety. And I was a little bit irascible, and I said, let me ask you something. Is it really important to determine my gender in order to check the meaning? And he was like, and then, of course, the problem is he was so polite that he said, of course not, Mr. Madam, Mr. Anyway, you could say it was a kind of cruelty on my part not to have alleviated his anxiety, but for some reason I was feeling kind of truculent and I wasn't able to do it. Although I guess feeling bad about it, the next day I was in the swimming pool in the same hotel, and I was getting dressed, and a woman came in. I think I was mainly dressed, I think so. And a woman and her friend came in, a young woman, and she said, oh, I think I must be in the wrong place here. And she said, let's go ask. And she said, do the ladies and the blokes both change in here? And I said, no. And then I realized she was really freaked out. And I think I was feeling guilty about the other guy. So I just said, I'm a lady. She looked at me. It was the first time in my life I've ever said that. But you know what? At a certain point, you just get, it's like, oh my God, I can't stand all these people suffering. So I just handed it to her. I said, I'm a lady. Well, at least I'll have a story to tell, which I told. Anyway, you can see sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's less easy to inhabit such categories or to be inhabited by them. I think they're complex social institutions. They do produce a lot of anxiety, which is part of what we've seen on the streets in these demonstrations against gender, against that form of anxiety, against that form of aggression, against that fearful prospect that people may not be what they seem, or they might be in the course of becoming something else. But I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Yes. Can you tell us your name too?
Yes. My name is Elise.
Hi, Elise.
I was wondering, I know that you focused more on French when you were just speaking now. Are there other languages that you focused on before in translating? Maybe if you could speak a little bit, if you've looked at other languages and
Yes.
if there's differences, maybe even if you've looked at non-Latin languages?
Yes, well, especially, I worked closely with a translator in Japanese, and then I've also spoken at length with some other scholars in China, and we talked a little bit about how inflection works. And also, I think in the paper that I gave you, there are kind of 4 different ways you can actually make reference to what I would call gender, and they're not completely commensurable. In several languages, including German, gender is linked to the idea of species. So the idea of Geschlecht in German is linked to species, which really makes it into a kind of natural typology of a certain kind, and also raises questions about the link between gender and animality, really, that I find very interesting. Of course, there are others as well. I work with a Turkish translator rather closely, and that's also a problem because there is no word. So she's had to come up with some kind of lengthy phrases for describing what I'm talking about in any given circumstance, but there's no one word that she can use in every circumstance. So it's highly contextualized.
Yeah, I just have a question. So a lot of languages, the English language not specifically, but a lot of languages are inherently gendered. So like conjugation of verbs
Yes.
is inherently gendered. And I was wondering how you deal with this, because just part of the language is the separation of the genders. And I was wondering how this comes up in your translation and like using those ideas.
Well, it's a problem. I think that several translators have chosen to either scramble the pronouns or the le and the la, the d and the der, especially in Romance languages or those coming out of Latin roots. They scramble them or they try to neuter them. Most of the interesting work that's been done on that has happened in literary writing, like the work of Monique Wittig, or even in English, if we think about what Jeanette Winterson has tried to do with narration, it's rather interesting. I don't know what I think about all those experimental forms. I think they're important. They produce stumbling blocks in many of those languages, so some people get just too frustrated with them. But I'm not of the view that the gendering of nouns in various languages reproduces the problems that we associate with gender as such, although some people do take that view. But I think it's important to link it. And also the way in which gender sometimes does mean genre, and sometimes it means species. So how does it relate to literary form? How does it relate to language? How does it relate to biological categorizations? All of that gets, I think, problematized in some interesting ways. I don't believe if we just changed our vocabulary, it would change our world. But sometimes we have to change our vocabulary.
Patrick?
I've been doing a lot of thinking about the situation in France because, I mean, obviously coming from the Canadian context where gay access to marriage happened a lot earlier, 2005. So struggles have sort of taken a different shape here and usually moved on from it, and then sort of in line with the sort of struggles to de-center the marriage agenda in the US as like the only thing that any queer money or organizing goes toward. Especially just because in France, like a lot of the tone that's being taken towards the protesting and the rioting and that's going on tends to be this kind of very patrician, kind of like hard Democrat approach of being like, well, we already voted and now the government is, executing that will, and it sounds like this horrible like right-wing rhetoric, but it's because it's, giving gays access to this or that. Suddenly I see people on the left or on certain portions of the left taking it up. So I was sort of wondering what your thoughts are on how to sort of like deal more complexly with, or think more complexly through this sort of resistance that's happening, and like look at sort of the different strains that are happening when because people are being attacked by the police at these demonstrations.
I know.
And so yeah, I was wondering what your take is on that.
I just find it enormously painful.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always held that that marriage rights should be extended to everyone despite sexual orientation. I'm a little bit unclear why only 2 people can get married. I mean, why stay within the dyad and open it up? I mean, okay, but that's not popular, and people don't want me to talk that way. But I mean, there is an issue. I mean, I don't really. Anyway, especially when you think about guardian relationships and like parenting structures and how complex they can be. Especially in serial relationships or biological and non-biological. I mean, it's difficult, and there should be ways to kind of allow for us, kind of tightly assembled groups to have whatever status they want. Anyway, so I am in favor of thinking about kinship and conjugality differently. But at the same time, I think it's a basic civil right that marriage has to be extended to gay and lesbian couples. It's so hard for me to say, because well, what about bisexuals? Are they included? Anyway, regardless of sexual orientation, right? Really important to define it negatively like that so that we don't end up constituting new subject positions that end up effacing others. At the same time, I think we have to see that some of the same homophobia that we see coming out against gay marriage is what we see coming out against gay, lesbian, non-gender conforming, bi, trans, intersex people everywhere. The non-conformity with the idea of what the natural relation is supposed to be between sex and social form is there. It's there in different ways. I mean, this historian who committed suicide in Notre Dame, kind of self-glorifying, but shocking. And then the violence against those who were celebrating their newly won rights. I mean, why is it that this is an issue that people feel so strongly about, that they would kill themselves or threaten, hurt, or possibly even kill others? And I think we have to kind of stand back for a moment and think about what those investments are, the way in which people understand their sex as linked to their sexuality, as to marriage, to family, to nation. and how gay marriage in some contexts seems to threaten that set of links, especially the patrilineal link, in such a way that life is not thinkable if those links are considered changeable, right? Which is the same reason they don't like gender, because there's some kind of implicit idea that things could be different, or there might be several forms. And those are very, very strong, I would say, kind of violent investments that can't be underestimated. So maybe the question is not so much how do we think about marriage rights in relationship to these other forms of kinship, sociability, intimacy, socially and legally. Maybe the real question is how do we start to think about homophobia, transphobia, misogyny in new ways such that our formulations can embrace the complex forms in which it emerges, because it emerges in linked but different forms in all of those contexts. So I think it's a moment to go back to the drawing board to understand something of what that intense, violent investment might be.
Let's just take one final question here.
Hi, I'm Alex Ketchum. I was wondering, what's your relationship with the translators? Do you rely on them fully for the cultural context, or do you bring in other academics who, like, their first language is, for example, like French or Chinese, and they kind of consult with the translators? Because I think it would be really difficult for a translator who doesn't have this background knowledge of queer studies or gender studies. So I was hoping you could speak to that.
So most of the people who translate my work into other languages are philosophers and feminists and gender theorists, or people who work really deeply in the field. And they tend to be the only possible person who could have translated the work. So it's true that in languages that I read, which would include German, French, and Spanish, I will take a look. Sometimes in Italian too, I'll take a look just to see if there's a big problem. But I trust them. I also assume that my book's going to become something different in another language, and that I don't want it to be faithful to the original. I want it to live somewhere else. And enter into another set of discussions and another set of associations and another set of meanings. And that's what it is to be translated, is to give it away, is to give it away and let it become something else. And sometimes then new responses come back to you and you learn something about how your work travels and how it can't. And it's really, it's actually not mine anymore, it's not my property. I feel like translation is what's the word? Expropriation of my work in a happy and productive way. So, that's how it goes. I mean, there are brief moments where the undoing of gender was translated into Italian as the defeat of gender. I was like, no. Like, no. So I'll draw a line there. But, other than that, take it or take it.